Sometimes the smallest name on a piece of paper is the one that changes the biggest room. The lobby of Ashford Biomedical Group gleamed beneath the late morning sun, every polished marble tile reflecting quiet wealth and careful ambition. Executives crossed the floor with measured confidence. Assistants hurried between elevators carrying digital tablets, and visitors lowered their voices as though success itself demanded silence. Near the revolving glass doors, however, one man stood almost unnoticed. Darius Coleman adjusted the worn strap of a faded backpack resting on his shoulder before smoothing the front of a neatly pressed but well-used navy work shirt. The fabric had faded from years of honest labor, but every button was fastened. Every wrinkle had been carefully pressed. His boots showed their age, yet they had been cleaned before sunrise. In one hand, he carried a simple folder containing exactly 6 sheets of paper. No college degree, no executive references, no impressive certifications. Just an employment history filled with maintenance jobs, hospital repairs, building upkeep, and a letter explaining that after months of searching, he would gladly accept a janitor position. He smiled politely at the receptionist, as if this building belonged to everyone equally. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm here for the custodial opening." The receptionist barely looked up before taking the folder. Years behind that polished desk had trained her eyes to estimate people within seconds. Expensive suit, executive, tailored dress, investor, delivery driver, maintenance applicant. She offered the same professional smile she reserved for people unlikely to return. "Please have a seat, Mr. Coleman." Darius thanked her and quietly walked toward a chair beside the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. He noticed a young maintenance worker struggling to push an overloaded supply cart across the glossy floor. Without saying a word, Darius stood, steadied one wobbling wheel, and helped guide the cart through a narrow hallway before returning to his seat. Nobody applauded. Nobody thanked him. The young employee simply nodded with embarrassed gratitude. Darius answered with a warm smile that expected nothing in return. Upstairs, 47 floors above the lobby, Evelyn Ashford signed the final page of a billion-dollar acquisition agreement without hesitation. Her office overlooked nearly the entire city, yet her attention never lingered on the skyline. Every minute had a purpose. Every conversation had a deadline. Her executive assistant entered carrying a digital hiring report. The custodial department sent over today's applicants for approval. Evelyn extended her hand without lifting her eyes from another contract. She reviewed applications the way she reviewed financial statements, quickly, efficiently, emotionally detached. The first file, rejected. The second, forwarded to human resources. The third, she paused. Her fingers stopped moving. Her breathing changed almost imperceptibly. The pen slipped from her hand and rolled across the polished walnut desk. Printed near the top of the application were 2 ordinary words. Darius Coleman. The room became impossibly still. Outside, helicopters crossed the bright summer sky. Phones continued ringing throughout the executive floor. Somewhere a printer hummed. Yet inside Evelyn's office, time seemed unwilling to move. She stared at the name again, afraid to blink, as though 23 years had quietly folded themselves into one impossible moment. Her assistant frowned with concern. "Ms. Ashford." Evelyn never answered. Her eyes remained fixed on those 2 words, not because they belonged to another janitor applicant, but because they belonged to a memory she had never managed to leave behind. The assistant standing beside Evelyn's desk waited several long seconds before speaking again. "Would you like human resources to continue with the interviews?" Evelyn slowly picked up the pen but never looked away from the application. Her expression remained calm, practiced, almost impossible to read, yet something behind her eyes had changed. "No," she said quietly. "Send Mr. Coleman to the executive floor." The assistant blinked. "Directly to your office?" "Yes." There was no hesitation in her voice now. "Personally escort him." Within minutes the instructions spread across departments, with the speed reserved for emergencies. The head of human resources frowned at the unexpected order. A vice president paused outside the conference room after overhearing it. Even the receptionist downstairs looked up in confusion when her phone rang. She listened carefully before lowering the receiver. Her professional smile returned, but this time it carried genuine surprise. She walked toward the waiting area where Darius sat reading a small paperback novel he had pulled from his backpack. He closed it immediately when she approached. Mr. Coleman? Yes, ma'am. The chief executive officer would like to meet you personally. Darius looked over his shoulder, certain she must have meant someone else. Me? Yes, sir. He stood politely, slipped the book into his backpack, and picked up his folder. Thank you. There was no excitement in his voice. No nervous laughter. Only quiet respect. As they crossed the lobby, employees glanced toward him with puzzled expressions. A janitor applicant was not supposed to bypass multiple interviews and go directly to the top floor. One security officer discreetly adjusted his earpiece, assuming some administrative mistake had occurred. Another whispered, "What is going on?" Nobody seemed to know. Inside the private elevator, the city slowly disappeared beneath them as the numbers climbed higher and higher. Darius stood with relaxed posture, hands folded loosely in front of him. The silence did not seem to bother him. He had spent years working in hospitals where quiet often meant people were resting, healing, or simply gathering strength for another difficult day. He treated silence like an old friend rather than an uncomfortable stranger. The executive assistant studied him from the corner of her eye. Most applicants grew restless during moments like this. They straightened their clothes every few seconds. They rehearsed answers beneath their breath. They checked their reflections in the mirrored walls. Darius did none of those things. Instead, he noticed a tiny scratch near the elevator control panel. Someone must have caught that with a maintenance card, he said softly, almost to himself. It is small, but if moisture gets underneath the finish, it will spread. The assistant looked at the scratch for the first time. She had ridden this elevator hundreds of times without ever noticing it. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, sunlight spilled across polished hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows stretching toward the skyline. Every office door stood closed. Every conversation seemed carefully measured. The assistant stopped outside a pair of tall walnut doors bearing a simple silver nameplate. Ashford. She turned toward him. She has cleared her entire schedule for this meeting. Darius offered a puzzled smile. That is very generous for someone applying to clean floors. Before she could answer, the doors quietly opened from the inside. The office felt strangely quiet for a place where billion-dollar decisions were made every day. Darius stepped inside only after the assistant motioned him forward. The walnut doors closed softly behind him, leaving only the distant hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Evelyn Ashford stood near the glass with her back turned, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the window. She had negotiated with investors twice her age, spoken before international conferences, and built one of the fastest-growing biomedical companies in the country. Yet for several long seconds, she could not find the words to greet a man applying for an entry-level custodial position. Darius waited patiently. He had learned years ago that silence often carried more meaning than conversation. Finally, Evelyn turned toward him. Her expression was composed, elegant, almost unreadable, but her eyes searched his face with quiet intensity. Time had changed him. Thin strands of gray framed his closely trimmed hair. Fine lines surrounded his eyes. His shoulders carried the posture of someone who had spent decades lifting more than equipment. Yet there was something untouched by time. The same calm, the same gentle steadiness, the same kindness resting naturally behind his eyes. "Mr. Coleman," she said at last. "Thank you for coming upstairs." Darius smiled politely. "Thank you for inviting me, Ms. Ashford. I appreciate the opportunity." She gestured toward a chair across from her desk. "Please have a seat." He waited until she sat first before taking the chair himself. The folder remained neatly folded across his lap. Evelyn opened his application once again, although she already knew every line. She was not reading the words anymore. She was listening to the memories they awakened. "You have worked in hospitals for nearly 15 years, she said. "Mostly maintenance." "Yes, ma'am. And before that, several schools, apartment buildings, wherever steady work was available." She nodded slowly. "You have never worked inside a corporate headquarters?" "No, ma'am." "Why apply here?" Darius answered without rehearsed confidence. "Because honest work is still honest work. Floors deserve to be clean whether people notice them or not. Someone has to care about the places everyone else walks through." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment. It was such a simple answer, yet it sounded exactly like something she remembered hearing long ago. She looked up again. "You are raising your daughter alone?" A warmth immediately softened his face. "Yes, ma'am. Zoe is 9 now. She keeps me busier than any full-time job ever could." A quiet laugh escaped him before he added, "She tells me every morning that I worry too much." Evelyn found herself smiling before she realized it. It was small, almost invisible, but it surprised even her. "Children usually know us better than we know ourselves," she said. Darius nodded. "I believe that is true." The room settled into another comfortable silence. Evelyn noticed the photograph partially visible inside his worn wallet as he adjusted it on the desk. A little girl with bright curls grinned while holding a homemade science project. The edges of the photograph had been folded and unfolded so many times that they had become soft. Nothing expensive, nothing carefully staged. Just a father carrying the most important picture in his world wherever he went. Evelyn stared at the photograph, and somewhere deep inside a memory stirred again, refusing to stay buried. Evelyn gently closed the folder without realizing her fingertips were resting on the cover a little longer than necessary. The interview had drifted far away from resumes and qualifications. Neither of them seemed interested in discussing cleaning supplies or maintenance schedules anymore. Instead, she leaned back slightly and asked a question that had nothing to do with employment. "Tell me something, Mr. Coleman. What do you do when life becomes heavier than you expected?" Darius looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. Hundreds of people hurried through the streets below, each carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. He smiled quietly before answering. "I usually make coffee, sit with my daughter at the kitchen table, and listen to whatever she wants to talk about. Sometimes it is science. Sometimes it is why squirrels always look busy. Children have a way of reminding us that the world keeps moving." Evelyn listened without interrupting. His answer carried no bitterness, no complaint, only gratitude wrapped inside ordinary moments. "You make it sound simple," she said. "Most important things usually are," Darius replied. "People only make them complicated after they forget what matters." Something inside Evelyn tightened. Those words brushed against an old memory she could almost reach but not fully grasp. She stood and walked toward a small bookshelf built into the far wall. Most visitors assumed it held business awards or medical journals, but among the polished volumes rested several worn novels whose pages had yellowed with age. She ran one finger across their spines before asking another unexpected question. "Do you still read often?" Darius's face brightened immediately. "Every week. Even after long workdays?" "Especially after long workdays." He laughed softly. "Books slow my thoughts down. My daughter says reading together is our favorite vacation that does not cost anything." Evelyn remained facing the bookshelf so he would not notice the emotion quietly passing across her face. 23 years earlier, another voice had spoken almost those exact words inside a neighborhood library. She could still remember sitting alone at a wooden table, frightened after a difficult afternoon she had never fully talked about with anyone. A young maintenance worker shelving returned books had noticed her without asking questions. He had simply placed a novel in front of her and smiled. "Sometimes stories help people breathe again," he had said. She had carried those words into adulthood without ever remembering the man's full face. Only his voice, only his kindness, only his name. She slowly turned back toward Darius. "Would you mind waiting here for a few minutes?" she asked. "Of course not. There is something I would like to confirm." He nodded politely. "Take all the time you need." After leaving the office, Evelyn walked alone down a quiet hallway toward a private storage room rarely opened anymore. Inside were neatly labeled boxes from every chapter of her life. School photographs, old journals, family keepsakes. She knelt before one faded cardboard box marked Simply Childhood and carefully lifted the lid. Beneath old birthday cards and report cards rested a small library card tucked inside the pages of a worn paperback novel. The handwriting had faded, but two words remained perfectly clear. "Thank you, Darius." Evelyn closed her eyes as her heartbeat quietly echoed through the silent room. Down the hall, completely unaware of the memories unfolding beyond those walls, Darius sat peacefully in the executive office, looking out over the city with the same quiet patience that had changed a frightened little girl's world decades before. When Evelyn returned to her office, she carried nothing in her hands, yet somehow the room felt different. The small library card remained safely inside the old box, but the memory it had awakened had followed her upstairs. Darius immediately stood as she entered. "Thank you for waiting, Ms. Ashford. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Coleman." She resumed her seat with the same composed posture she displayed in every board meeting, although her thoughts were no longer focused on quarterly reports or company strategy. She studied the man across from her for another quiet moment before speaking. I would like to ask one final favor before I make any hiring decision. Darius nodded. Certainly. Would you be willing to spend the afternoon observing our facilities instead of interviewing? He looked mildly surprised. Observing? Just walk through the building. Meet no one officially. Simply tell me afterward what you notice. He smiled politely. I can do that. Evelyn pressed a small button on her desk. Her executive assistant entered almost immediately. Please give Mr. Coleman temporary visitor access to every floor except the research laboratories. The assistant hesitated only for a second before nodding. Yes, Ms. Ashford. Less than 10 minutes later, Darius quietly walked through the headquarters wearing a visitor badge instead of an employee identification card. Nobody announced who he was. Nobody explained why the chief executive officer had personally authorized his access. He became almost invisible again, just another man walking through long hallways carrying an old backpack. Yet invisibility had always allowed him to notice what others overlooked. On the 8th floor, he paused beside a drinking fountain where a young intern struggled to collect scattered folders after accidentally dropping them across the hallway. Before she could apologize, Darius knelt beside her and gathered every page in careful order, checking that none had been mixed together. Everyone has days like this, he said gently. Do not let 5 minutes decide how you feel about yourself. The young woman smiled with visible relief. Thank you, sir. You are welcome. He continued walking without asking her name. On another floor, he noticed a maintenance closet whose door no longer closed properly. He gently pushed it open, examined the loose hinge without touching any company tools, and quietly mentioned the issue to a passing facilities supervisor. If someone pulls this too hard, the hinge may fail completely. It would be an easy repair now instead of an expensive one later. The supervisor thanked him, assuming he was simply an experienced tradesman. Far above, Evelyn watched the security monitors without sound. She had instructed the control room not to follow him constantly, only to alert her if anything unusual happened. Instead, the unusual thing was how ordinary every interaction appeared. He never tried to impress anyone. He never mentioned meeting the chief executive officer. He never hinted that he might soon work there. He simply helped wherever the next small need appeared, then quietly moved on. Late that afternoon, Darius stepped into the employee cafeteria and noticed an elderly custodian eating alone beside the windows. Every nearby table sat empty, yet instead of choosing his own seat, he carried his tray across the room. May I join you? He asked. The older man smiled. Please do. They spent the next 20 minutes talking about grandchildren, weather, coffee, and baseball. Nothing about money. Nothing about status. Watching from another monitor, Evelyn slowly realized something she had spent years searching for inside leadership seminars and corporate training manuals. Respect could not be taught through presentations. It was revealed by how someone treated people when they believed nobody important was watching. As the afternoon light slowly stretched across the glass walls of the headquarters, Evelyn asked Darius to return to her office before he left for the day. He knocked softly and stepped inside with the same quiet humility he had carried from the moment he entered the building. You wanted to see me, Ms. Ashford? She motioned toward the chair, but remained standing herself. I did. I would like to hear your thoughts. Darius placed his visitor badge on the desk before speaking. Your building is beautiful. Evelyn smiled faintly. That sounds like the safe answer. He laughed gently. You asked for my honest one. She nodded. Please. He looked toward the skyline before choosing his words carefully. The equipment is well maintained. The maintenance staff clearly takes pride in their work. The laboratories are organized. The public areas are spotless. But, he paused. Go on. Some people smile because they enjoy working here. Others smile because they think they have to. Evelyn remained silent. I noticed supervisors greeting executives by name, Darius continued. I also noticed several custodians, cafeteria workers, and security officers passing through the same hallways almost unnoticed. Buildings are easier to maintain than people. People need to feel seen. The room became perfectly still. Those words landed with surprising weight because they echoed something Evelyn herself had struggled to define for years. She had invested millions into innovation, technology, and leadership programs. Yet one applicant for a custodial position had summarized the company's greatest weakness in less than a minute. She slowly walked toward a cabinet beside her desk and unlocked the lowest drawer. Inside rested a small cedar box whose edges had softened with age. She carried it carefully to the conference table and opened the lid. Darius watched quietly without asking questions. Evelyn removed an old paperback novel, its cover faded from countless readings. Tucked inside was a worn library card with rounded corners and handwriting faded by time. She slid it gently across the table. "Would you look at this?" Darius adjusted his reading glasses and carefully lifted the card. His fingers paused as he read the message written in uneven letters. "Thank you, Darius." His brow furrowed with quiet confusion. "I do not remember this." Evelyn was not surprised. "I hoped you might." He looked again, searching the faded ink as though it belonged to someone else's life. "Was this from a library?" "Yes. I worked evenings at a neighborhood library when I was younger." He smiled apologetically. "A long time ago." Evelyn's voice softened almost to a whisper. "Do you remember a little girl who spent hours sitting alone at the reading table every Thursday after school?" Darius closed his eyes for a moment, reaching into memories buried beneath decades of ordinary life. Faces came and went. Children reading picture books. Parents searching for novels. Elderly neighbors borrowing newspapers. Hundreds of conversations. Hundreds of quiet afternoons. Finally, he opened his eyes and slowly shook his head. "I am sorry. I wish I did." Evelyn looked down at the library card resting between them. There was no disappointment in her expression, only gratitude. "That is exactly what I expected you to say," she answered gently. "Because the people who change lives through kindness rarely keep a record of whose lives they changed." Darius looked at her with quiet curiosity, still unaware that the greatest interview of his life had never been about getting a job at all. Evelyn took a slow breath before sitting across from Darius instead of behind her desk. For the first time that afternoon, there was no polished executive furniture separating them. Only a small wooden table, an old library card, and more than 2 decades of untold history. She rested her hand lightly beside the faded piece of cardstock. 23 years ago, she began quietly. "My father traveled almost every week, and my mother believed the library was the safest place for me after school." Darius listened without interrupting. "I was a lonely little girl," she continued. "I always chose the same table near the back window. I pretended to read because I did not want anyone to notice that I had no friends waiting for me." Her eyes drifted toward the skyline. Though she was no longer seeing the city, she was seeing another building entirely. "One afternoon, I accidentally spilled an entire stack of books across the floor. I remember feeling so embarrassed that I wanted to disappear." A faint smile touched her face. "Before I could pick them up, someone knelt beside me. He never laughed. He never acted impatient. He simply helped me gather every book and asked which story I had been trying to borrow." Darius lowered his eyes toward the library card again. His expression remained thoughtful but uncertain. Evelyn continued, her voice carrying the warmth of a treasured memory. "That young man worked there after finishing his regular job. He repaired shelves, sorted returns, fixed broken chairs, and somehow always found time to help children choose books." She paused for a moment before adding, "One day he noticed I looked frightened. He did not ask me what was wrong. He placed a novel on the table and said, 'Sometimes stories help people breathe again.'" Darius's fingers slowly tightened around the edge of the library card. Those words stirred something distant, like sunlight breaking through morning fog. Not a complete memory, only a feeling. Evelyn reached into the cedar box once more and removed a faded photograph no larger than a postcard. The picture showed the reading corner of a neighborhood library decorated for a summer reading program. Several children smiled toward the camera. In the background, almost hidden beside a bookshelf, stood a young black maintenance worker holding a stack of returned novels. Darius leaned closer. His eyes widened slightly. "I remember that library," he whispered. "They asked all the employees to stand for a group picture." Evelyn nodded. "That was you." He stared at the younger version of himself, smiling without realizing a camera had captured the moment. Then his gaze shifted toward a little girl sitting cross-legged on the carpet with an open book resting in her lap. "That little girl," Evelyn finished the sentence for him, "was me." Silence filled the office, but this time it was no longer uncertain. It was full of recognition. Darius looked back at Evelyn, searching her face with new understanding. You were the child who always borrowed books about scientists. She smiled through eyes beginning to shine. And every Thursday you saved the newest one for me before anyone else could check it out. Darius let out a quiet breath of amazement. I thought I was only putting a book aside. Evelyn gently shook her head. No, Mr. Coleman. You were giving a lonely little girl something to look forward to every single week. You never knew it, but those afternoons became the safest part of my childhood, and I have carried them with me every day since. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The city continued moving beyond the windows, thousands of people hurrying through another ordinary afternoon, completely unaware that two lives had quietly reconnected inside the highest office of the building. Darius looked down at the faded photograph once more before carefully placing it beside the library card. I wish I could tell you that I remembered every detail, he said softly. But I cannot. Evelyn nodded with complete understanding. I never expected you to. He folded his hands together and smiled with gentle embarrassment. Back then I worked 2 jobs. During the day I repaired equipment at a community center. In the evenings I helped at the library because they needed someone to fix shelves and organize returns. There were so many children. He paused before adding with a quiet laugh. I probably recommended hundreds of books. Evelyn's smile grew warmer. That is exactly why I never stopped looking for you. He looked up, surprised. Looking for me? After my family moved away, I returned to that library years later. Her eyes drifted toward the old novel resting on the table. The building had been renovated. Most of the staff had retired. Someone remembered your first name, but nobody knew where life had taken you. She sighed gently. Eventually, I stopped searching because I believed I had waited too long. Darius shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. And today I walked into your company asking for a custodial job. Yes, Evelyn answered. Life has a remarkable sense of timing. A comfortable silence settled between them once again. It no longer felt like the silence of strangers. It felt like 2 people honoring something neither wealth nor time had managed to erase. Finally, Darius spoke. Can I tell you something honestly? Please. I never thought those afternoons were extraordinary. He glanced toward the skyline before continuing. I simply noticed a little girl who always sat alone. You seemed to relax whenever someone treated you like you belonged there. That seemed important. Evelyn lowered her eyes as emotion quietly softened her voice. It was more important than you could ever imagine. She leaned back and folded her hands. There were many people in my childhood who taught me how to succeed. Tutors, teachers, consultants, business leaders. But you were the first adult who taught me that kindness could exist without expecting anything in return. Darius remained still, absorbing every word. I built this company believing innovation could improve lives, Evelyn continued. Somewhere along the way I became so focused on performance that I forgot the lesson you gave me before I was even a teenager. People do not remember the titles of those who impressed them nearly as long as they remember the character of those who made them feel seen. Darius smiled quietly. My daughter says something similar. Evelyn looked up with curiosity. She does. Whenever I worry about making enough money or finding better work, Zoe tells me, Dad, people always come home remembering who was nice to them. Evelyn laughed softly through the moisture gathering in her eyes. She is a very wise little girl. Darius smiled with unmistakable pride. She learned by watching better people than me. Evelyn gently shook her head. No, Mr. Coleman. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with conviction. She learned by watching exactly the man who once changed a frightened little girl's future without ever realizing he had done anything remarkable. That is the kind of person no company can afford to overlook. The evening sun painted long golden reflections across the glass walls as Evelyn slowly closed the cedar box and placed it back inside the cabinet. When she turned around again, she was no longer carrying the weight of an unfinished memory. She walked to her desk, opened a slim leather portfolio, and removed a single envelope embossed with the Ashford biomedical seal. She placed it gently in front of Darius. This is not an offer for the custodial position, she said with a quiet smile. Darius looked at the envelope, but made no move to open it. Then I am not sure I understand. Evelyn folded her hands. Inside is an offer to become Director of Employee Experience and Workplace Culture. Darius blinked in surprise. There must be some mistake. There is not. Ms. Ashford, I have never managed a department. I have never worked in a corporate office. I have spent my life repairing broken equipment. Evelyn nodded. Exactly. He looked at her with genuine confusion. I do not have the qualifications people expect for a position like this. Perhaps not on paper, she answered. But today you repaired something inside this company that no consultant has managed to fix in years. She stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Every executive here understands strategy. Every manager understands productivity. Very few understand dignity. Yet everywhere you walked today, people stood a little straighter after speaking with you. They smiled without being told to smile. They felt respected. She turned back toward him. That cannot be taught through spreadsheets. Darius remained silent for a long moment before finally opening the envelope. He carefully read every page, then closed it just as gently as he had opened it. This is more generosity than I deserve. Evelyn smiled softly. No, it is gratitude that finally found the right address. Darius lowered his eyes, thinking of Zoe waiting for him at home, probably finishing her science homework at the kitchen table. He imagined telling her about the day, about the interview that somehow became a reunion neither of them could have imagined. Then he looked back at Evelyn. May I ask one condition before I give you my answer? Of course. If I accept this position, I would like to spend my first month working beside every custodial crew, every cafeteria employee, every maintenance technician, and every security officer. Evelyn listened carefully. I cannot help people understand their work if I have not shared it with them. A quiet laugh escaped her. That was exactly the answer I hoped you would give. She extended her hand across the desk. This time Darius accepted it without hesitation. It was not the handshake of a billionaire and a job applicant. It was the handshake of two people connected by a kindness that had quietly crossed 23 years without asking for recognition. As Darius walked toward the office doors, Evelyn called his name one last time. He turned. There is something I never thank you for. He smiled gently. You already have. She slowly shook her head. No, I built a company because I wanted to change the future. You taught me, long before I ever became a leader, that the future changes one person at a time. Darius nodded with the same quiet humility that had never left him. Then let us make sure everyone who walks into this building feels like they belong. The doors closed softly behind him, and for the first time in many years, Evelyn looked out across the city without thinking about profits, deadlines, or markets. She thought instead about a father who had never realized that one ordinary act of kindness inside a neighborhood library had echoed across decades, proving that the greatest legacies are rarely built through power. They are built through the quiet decision to make another human being feel seen.